Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's Art Nugget. So, for this week's artwork, I put a poll up on Instagram because I was kind of deciding between which two pieces I should do. The one is the Visitation and Baptism from Zaganelli that we did in class this week and that I thought was really, really interesting. And the other one was the Floris's Crucifixion. And the big majority voted for the crucifixion. So that's what we're going to look at today. I really, really love this piece by Frans Floris. He created it in 1554 as a commission piece for Cardinal Granville from Spain. So there's a whole history behind it. And there's some interesting things about Floris himself. So Floris is a Flemish painter, and this piece was created in the middle of the period of the Reformation. And what makes it so interesting, and Floris as an artist so interesting, is that he himself went through a Reformation process. So, for example, you can see in Frans Floris's work that Mary is very central, and we'll come to that. And comparing this to later pieces that he did, later crucifixions, you can see that Mary has kind of disappeared, um, or his treatment of the crucifixion has changed. So that's a really interesting, different topic that I would like to get into, and that I might write a different article on. Um, so the history of the artist and the artwork itself is really interesting. So I also why I love this piece is, and I wrote my exam essay on this crucifixion, is what I find so interesting is the presence of the woman at the crucifixion, and how extremely prominent the women are. Um, Approaching this from a feminist perspective and the type of feminist readings that I normally do is looking at this artwork. My immediate questions are: who are these women? Why are they so prominent? And what does it mean for us as viewers looking at this artwork and seeing how prominent these women are? What is the artist? What is our connection with the women, and what is the artist trying to do with placing the women so central? What also makes this artwork extremely interesting is reading it in the backdrop of John, so the narrative of John. So I say reading it in the backdrop of the narrative of John because John's gospel is the only gospel where we have Mary mentioned at all at the foot of the cross. So I put a little table up here that I also used in my presentation uh, about this artwork in class. So when we look at the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, although Luke is most often described as the gospel about women because it features a lot more women than some of the other gospels do. John in chapter 19, verse 25 to 27, is where the author speaks about the crucifixion and specifically addresses Mary's presence at the foot of the cross and also specifically mentions her. Now, whilst John doesn't specifically mention Mary by name like anywhere in the gospel, in fact, Mary is only mentioned twice throughout the Gospel of John, this crucifixion narrative being the one and the other one being the wedding at Cana. Um, she is mentioned here directly and is also the first person that Jesus speaks to from the cross, which really speaks to her prominence. And um, interpreters and commentators have throughout centuries debated the meaning of Mary at the cross in this instance. And for me, when approaching this, it's really important to look at Mary in context of the whole Gospel of John and This is also where in John at least we find a big the biggest influence regarding our understanding of Mary in theology, in terms of her role as intercessor at the wedding of Cana and the close relationship that she had with Jesus, and also some people's understanding and arguably my understanding of Mary as the first disciple of Jesus. So when reading John 19, verse 20, 25 to 27, it's very important to keep the wedding at Cana in mind as well. Now, that being said, it's a lot. I'm not going to get into that now. I am going to write an article on this specific Frans Floris piece. So when that is finished, I will happily share the link, and everyone can read. Otherwise, you can also have a chat with me. It's really interesting. So, why I'm specifically interested in Frans Floris's work is because, as I said, reading it in the backdrop of John 19, verse 25 to 27, we can see that there has some artistic liberty has been taken with reference to the depiction of the crucifixion scene and Mary and John the Evangelist's presence at the foot of the cross. Now, in John, Mary is specifically stated to be standing nearby, standing at the foot of the cross. This is very, very different from popular images of Mary at the foot of the cross, where we often see her fainting or swooning at the foot of the cross and her surrounded by women and supported by women. Um, so the question is, where did this discrepancy take place, or why is it important that in scripture she is standing, but in art we see her very clearly as fainting or as swooning and supported by other women? Now, the text of John is not the only written account of the gospel that we have where Mary is present. So, for instance, the biggest influence on of Mary as possibly fainting comes from the Gospel of Nicodemus, which is which is probably dated to around the 7th century, although that is also disputed. But generally, it's accepted that it's dated to around the 7th century. So, in the Gospel of Nicodemus, specifically in the Act of Pilate, chapter 10, we have this excerpt of describing how John goes to Mary and tells her what has happened to Jesus and that she has to come to the cross. And here we see it written at the and the mother of God hearing this and seeing him, this is Jesus being nailed to the cross, fainted and fell backwards to the ground and lay a considerable time. And the women, as many following her, stood round her and wept. Um, so this is an important account from the 7th century that we have of Mary fainting, and this could probably have influenced the cultural memory surrounding Mary's presence at the cross. Now, when looking at the history of the interpretation of the crucifixion scene, in terms of Mary's presence at the cross, in art, we see this development taking place over centuries. So we see from the Byzantine iconographic period that Mary and John are both present at the crucifixion. However, these figures are very poised. No movement is taking place. They're simply standing. Sometimes John is shown with his hands clasped or like wringing his hands, and Mary is just seen standing exactly the way she is described in the account of John. It's only until the 13th century where we begin to see Mary, the depiction of Mary progressing to where she is fainting. So, for example, we have um, Giotto's fresco, which is painted in 1304, I believe, where we see on the left hand side, Mary seems to be slumping and with her eyes closed, and a woman on the left and presumably John on the right supporting her, holding her hands, and we see Mary Magdalene at Jesus's feet. So this is the first stage in the progression of Mary fainting until we come to this type of 16th century, painted 1454, image of Mary completely splayed on the ground. She has completely fainted. She is supported by the women and laying on her knees and physically being held up, and they are extremely concerned about her. So we see this progression in time taking place. Now, what makes Frans Floris's work so interesting is that the leading scholar on Frans Floris's work, Voke, who is at the University of Manchester, he's written quite a few books on him, says that within this period, it's quite strange that the positioning of the women in the forefront of the narrative, um, and specifically it seems like the light is casted on them, so they become your first contact point with the artwork and they lead up to Jesus. Now that's interesting because in a narrative scene which this depicts, which is a crucial moment for Jesus and showing his crucifixion, we see that most of the attention, or at least half of the attention, is placed on Mary herself, Mary having been fainted. Now, this is interesting because within this period and a bit earlier, we see within the theology of Europe a big change from contemplative reflection that the monks in monasteries were doing, which was very intellectual, if I can put it in that type of way. We see a shift towards affective piety, where emotion becomes extremely important, and we see these emotion in the development of literature, in changing liturgy, and also the emotion that artworks are evoking. Now, in context of Mary and her role in John as an intercessor and having a important relationship with Jesus, showing Mary, Frans Floris showing Mary in this way creates an effective piety where we as the viewer sh- can experience empathy and sorrow for Jesus through connecting with Mary. So the scale of this artwork is really big, and the way it would be hung, although it was for private devotion for Cardinal Crivelli, no Granville, sorry, for Cardinal Granville, we would be looking up towards Mary being the closest to us, almost looking as if she's about to slip out of the artwork and we have to catch her as the viewer, or she would tumble out into us. You can see her cloak on the bottom um, is cut off, and it seems like her foot is just going to fall out of the artwork, out of the frame. Mary leads us up experiencing her anguish and her sorrow for seeing her only son being crucified, which is an extremely horrible and excruciating death, leading us up into looking at Jesus, who in return is looking up to the sky as if in those moments he is asking God, why have you forsaken me? Looking at the despair in his face. So for us as viewers, what Frans Floris is doing is he's creating a way for us to connect with Jesus through experiencing Mary. She is our intercession point for Jesus. And what's really interesting is Floris does this thing with the sense of touch, which, if you know a bit about the five senses and how they are experienced in Christianity or understood at least by patristic viewers, touch is the lowest ranking of the senses, and it was mostly to do with touch as being the sense of lust, of physical touch, and um, of luxuria, of lust. So touch isn't such an important sense, whereas seeing and hearing were one of the important senses. But what Floris does is he explores the sense of touch through the woman. So we have an extremely close connection that the women have. We have heads touching each other. Um, we have hands touching each other. We have Mary completely dependent on the bodies of the other women to keep her upright. And if you look closely, the Mary on the right in the yellow actually, in a way, cups or touches Mary's breast. Now, Mary's breast within medieval theology and later on theology at this stage, Mary's breast is understood as a symbol or an icon of humility and of Jesus's humanity. This, for example, you can think of the Madonnas, the breastfeeding Madonna, or the Virgin Lactans, as its title. The Virgin Lactans has Mary's breast bared and Jesus either touching the breast himself or suckling at her breast, and that symbolizes, through art, that symbolized Jesus's humanity. So here once again we have this touching of Mary's breast as a symbol and as a reminder of the humanity of Jesus, in the last few moments of his life, and also in a sense reminds us, casts us forward in events where we know, yes, Jesus's humanity is extremely important, but he will resurrect. He will be resurrected. So this is not final, but at this stage for Mary, she's unable to bear the suffering that that Jesus is going through. This is also really interesting because, um, in, I think it's the Golden Legend, or in a different account, it's described how Mary's heart will be pierced in the same way Jesus' side will be pierced with the spear. So Jesus' death spears Mary's heart, and causes her excruciating pain. So there's a parallel there with how Mary didn't experience any birthing pains at Jesus' birth, but she does experience excruciating pain at Jesus' death, which in a sense is also a rebirth and a new beginning. So there's extremely detailed symbolism that goes into an artwork like this. Now, my question is, and my reflection is, and which leads me into a way to approach my article, is how does viewing Frans Floris's work deepen our understanding of a reading of John 19, verse 25 to 27? And what I specifically want to focus on is how does that deepen our reading from a Protestant point of view? How can we learn from the importance of Mary and the intercessor role she has, and the role in this period of time, the role in that she played in theology as a way for viewers and for followers to connect through Mary in order to understand Christ. Or I should rather say how to feel Christ or how to feel with Christ. In this way, um, we in terms of imitating Christ, we also are able to imitate Mary, um, and to take on some of the characteristics that she represents, in order for us to be even closer to Jesus. So this is what I want to explore, and this is extremely interesting in terms of Frans Floris because he himself went through a change where Mary disappeared from later crucifixion scenes. So that's also something that I would like to explore in terms of how taking Mary out of crucifixion scenes, whether there is something lost there, the same way that I feel maybe there's something lost in our own connection, to experiencing Jesus if Mary is not there. So that's something that I'd like to explore. So this is a very quick, not so quick, almost a half hour explanation or exploration of Frans Floris's artwork. And if you'd like to discuss anything about this artwork, I hope it made sense, my rambling. Please feel free to reach out to me, and we can have a chat. And I really, really enjoyed working on this piece, and I think it brought something to my own understanding of the crucifixion narrative, and the passion narrative. And I'm hoping to share that in the form of my article. So I'll keep everyone updated on that. I'll see you at next week's Art Nugget.